Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock, and as of this recording is August 16th, 2024. Okay, I hope everybody is doing well on this fine Friday afternoon. And you're not losing your sanity, hopefully, and you're not succumbing to road rage if you live in Florida or Texas specifically, and California too, can't forget them, or pretty much any giant city. What's going on in the news today? Let's see. It's August 16th. The new Alien Romulus movie just came out. Gonna go see that later today in IMAX. I have high hopes. When I was a young lad, I think the second grade, my dad took me on Halloween to go see Alien Director's Cut in theater, and I gotta tell you, it was epic. It was great. It was, for an 8-year-old mind, it was terrifying and exhilarating. Probably contributed a lot to the way I am today. But anyway, so per the last episode, I talked about how this episode I was gonna go through World War I up through the end of World War II, touch on Korea and the Cold War a little bit, to provide some historical context about the situation leading up to and fueling the Vietnam conflict, specifically the rise of communism. And because I happen to be a World War I nerd, and because I think World War I gets glossed over in American history, at least, I'm going to spend a little more time on World War I today than the other wars, because people know World War II almost ad nauseum at this point, but people don't know World War I is. And World War I and World War II were really just part one and part two of the same movie. At the time that World War I was being fought, those that were fighting and the people at the time referred to it as the Great War or the war to end all war. And as you're going to see here, it's pretty easy to understand why the people of the time thought that that truly was the war to end all wars. At the end of World War I, economic reparations were levied against the German Empire, which absolutely decimated their economy, leading to hyperinflation and setting the conditions necessary for the rise of Adolf Hitler and then obviously World War II. Furthermore, and more importantly, for our purposes in discussing the Vietnam War, the rise of communism can be directly traced to World War I, specifically when the German government brought Vladimir Lenin out of exile and sent him back to Russia to sow discord amongst the populace, thereby creating so much social chaos back home that Russia basically collapsed. The government basically collapsed, and Lenin's Bolshevik revolution caused for the downfall of the royal family and the birth of the communist state of Russia, which during World War II became even more powerful. And after World War II, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union became the direct competitor to the United States at the conclusion of World War II. Now, add in the advent of the atomic bomb, and you can see that there's a shift in policy decision-making where nuclear-armed powers, i.e. the Soviet Union and the United States, will engage on a series of proxy wars. Now, a proxy war is a conflict where major powers support other parties to fight on their behalf, avoiding direct confrontation themselves. And as you can imagine, Soviet Union versus United States, both with nuclear weapons, yeah, I think everybody's okay with proxy wars if it's the alternative to nuclear annihilation. 3 notable proxy wars during the Cold War period are, first, Korea, which pitted the United States and the South Koreans against the communist North Korean and communist Chinese, backed also by the Soviet Union. The second proxy war of the Cold War was the war in Vietnam. Similar situation. You had North Vietnam, which was communist-led, fighting against the South Vietnamese, which was the United States-backed pro-democracy, pro-capitalism forces. And the third proxy war that you see during the Cold War is the United States armament of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, fighting against the Soviet Union when they invaded Afghanistan in the 80s. And there are other examples, but those are just the 3 that come to mind right away. And during the course of this podcast, we'll probably delve into those a little more. But getting back on track, let's get back into World War One. Now, the thing that kicks off World War One is going to sound like a conspiracy theory, and that's because it was a conspiracy. And, in the modern era, everything's a conspiracy theory. Everybody says that everything's a conspiracy theory if they don't like the implications for their particular agenda or political party. But the fact of World War One is that it was kicked off by a secret group of conspirators called the Black Hand. I you not, there was actually a Serbian nationalist secret society called the Black Hand, aka Death or Unification, and they were formed in 1901 to basically try to unite all South Slavic territories not ruled by Serbia or Montenegro. They were a revolutionary group. They executed terrorist activity, propaganda campaigns, political violence of various sorts, but most notably, they were responsible for planning and supporting another nationalist group called Young Bosnia during their attempt, and successful attempt at that, to assassinate the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and also his wife Sophie. So, the Black Hand. Why is it called the Black Hand? Well, just like a hand has 5 fingers, so too did a standard Black Hand cell have 5 members, and 4 of those members were subordinates, with 1 member being a leader who was the sole receiver of instruction from a central planning authority, and thereby the cells were compartmentalized such that if one became compromised, it would not compromise the entire network. It just goes to show that small groups of organized military and bureaucratic officials in the government working together in the shadows to orchestrate propaganda campaigns and assassination attempts isn't exactly anything new. Anyway, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand basically kicked off World War I because the Austro-Hungarian Empire now had reason to declare war against their rival Serbia. Serbia was an ally of Russia. This causes Russia to mobilize. When Russia mobilizes, this triggers Germany to execute a military plan of their own called the Schlieffen Plan. Ultimately, the Schlieffen Plan is built around the fact that Germany is sandwiched between Russia to the east and France to the west. Because France and Russia are allies, this puts Germany in an awkward position where it's likely to get crushed on 2 fronts by 2 massive military powers. And because Germany found itself in the predicament of being sandwiched between 2 enemies with massive military power, they came up with the strategy that basically their best option was to deploy 7/8 of its 1.9 million man army to the Western Front, i.e. to France, sweep through Belgium in a wide flanking envelopment maneuver designed at basically encircling Paris and knocking France out of the war immediately within a month, so that those forces that were not left behind to occupy France could be redeployed to the Eastern Front to go up against the Russians. The assumption was that the Russian military, because it was so big and because Russia is so massive, would take significantly longer than the Germans to mobilize. Therefore, it was a beat 'em to the punch scenario, but with 2 enemies. Idea is you punch one, knock him out, then you punch the other before he has the time to get out of the chair. Now, the innocent party in all this was Belgium, which was a neutral country, and they had no qualm, no skin in the game. So they see Germany coming through and they do what any sovereign nation would do, which is put up a fight. The Germans honestly expected the Belgians to essentially just let them go through because their beef wasn't with Belgium, it was with France. Now, just for some quick context, the German military boasted a 1.9 million man army. Russia's army was around 1.4 million, and France's army stood at 1.7 million people. So now you've got 3 separate things coming together to produce just epic annihilation on a scale nobody's seen before. And that is old style tactics, new style weapons, and massive armies just headed straight for each other. Now, Belgium's eastern frontier was protected by a fortress line of interlocking fortresses designed to canalize enemy forces into wide open killing grounds where machine guns and artillery would just annihilate entire armies that were canalized into these areas. This would have been fine and dandy, probably would have worked out for the Belgians, except the Germans had brand new, never before seen siege cannons, which were these massive, insanely huge artillery pieces. And these artillery pieces were set loose against the Belgium fortress line for about 11 days straight and just bombarded the ever-loving out of the Belgium's fortress line. Eventually, the fortresses literally collapsed in on the men holding the line, and the Germans were able to break through. They continued to steamroll through Belgium, defeating any resistance, and pushed on into France. By the time the Germans had made it through Belgium and into France, the British had sent 80,000 troops to help the French hold the line. This bought the French a little bit of time to slow down the Germans and basically implement a fighting retreat where they fought the Germans with rear action, meaning the Germans would advance, the French would meet them, the French would eventually get overrun, they would fall back, and they continued this action almost all the way to Paris, where ultimately they stopped some probably 30 or 40 miles outside of Paris, where they finally made their stand at the Marne. Okay, now, before the French and Germans met at the First Battle of the Marne, which ultimately caused the Germans to fail in their forward progression into Paris, before this happened, the French had a plan of their own. The Germans had the Schlieffen Plan, the French had Plan 17. Yes, I know. World War I plans had great names. The Schlieffen Plan, Plan 17. You can't make this stuff up. That's what I love about it. But essentially, Plan 17 was a military strategy developed to basically mobilize and concentrate French forces against Germany through the regions of Alsace and Lorraine. So, as a man trying to stab with all his force through the breastplate of another man with a dull knife, the French sent 5 armies to power through this region and into Germany, and ultimately led to a complete slaughterfest where the Germans holding the line just absolutely, you guessed it, annihilated the ever-living balls out of the French. To give you some idea, this is what a French officer recalled with absolute horror from what he witnessed on one of the battlefields. Just one of the battlefields along this front. Quote, "The battlefield afterward was an unbelievable spectacle. Thousands were still standing, supported as if by a flying buttress made of bodies lying in rows on top of each other in an ascending arc from horizontal to an angle of 60 degrees. Now, I don't know about you, but that's just an absolutely disturbing image to think that so many people died in human wave after human wave that there were literally piles so high that the last row of dead dudes were basically just slumped over, basically still standing, just supported by a whole pile of other dead dudes underneath them. The carnage at the First Battle of the Marne was no less gruesome. Across both sides, and over the course of 1 week, there were approximately 500,000 casualties. So, as you might very well imagine, million-man armies marching into wide open battlefields armed with artillery and machine guns and just charging at each other. It became a slaughter fest on both sides and eventually just became trench warfare. Each side recognizing that the hundreds of thousands of casualties that they were sustaining within the first month and a half of the war was unsustainable. They each began to dig trenches to shield themselves from artillery and machine gun fire. This trench line spanned from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps. Altogether, the entire trench complex for both sides totaled to about 475 miles of trenches. Now, these trenches weren't just parallel lines of trenches. They were very much maze-like labyrinth trench systems with a forward trench, communication trenches that span to the rear, a rear echelon trench, and even a third or fourth line of trenches where new soldiers coming to the front would enter. Then they would meander for hours through the trenches to make their way to the front. And life in the trenches was absolute pure hell. Men lived in mud, They had only a view of the sky above, and if they dared peek over the precipice and look out at no man's land, they were likely to just get shot in the head by a sniper or catch some shrapnel from artillery. And besides, the only thing that they would see was the rotting corpses of their dead buddies, bombed out muddy craters from the artillery, in just a desolate wasteland. Day-to-day life in the trench was basically the old adage of absolute boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. You're sitting in the trench, you only have the view of the sky above, and you and your buddies sitting around jaw-jacking, waiting for the word. The word's either, hey, we're going to try to assault through no man's land to push back the enemy trench line, which involves jumping into the trench and then engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy troops, or you're standing there waiting for the enemy to charge you. It became standard practice to soften up the enemy trench line with 30 minutes to an hour of constant artillery barrage, basically forcing the enemy to stay down in the trench, unable to see, and then as the artillery is lifted, the enemy troops charge up out of the trench into no man's land. Usually this was marked by some officer blowing a whistle, so you hear the whistle call, you get up, you get out of the trench, and you just start sprinting through the mud. Now, the enemy that you're assaulting, they've got artillery and they've got machine guns. So as soon as they sense that the artillery bombardment on them has ended, they send a counter artillery battery and machine gun fire back at the enemy, instantly prepared to receive the enemy onslaught. So as you can imagine, there was no situation in which the enemy is advancing and not just getting mowed down by artillery and machine guns. And so the idea was you send enough people, eventually some of them make it to the enemy trench, and of those that make it to the enemy trench, hopefully there's enough of them to engage in hand-to-hand combat, i.e. bayonets and fists, brass knuckles, clubs, and grenades, and just hope that enough of them survive long enough to kill the enemy in their trench. Then you capture their trench, and the line has been advanced a few hundred meters, if that, and then eventually the enemy initiates a counterattack and recaptures their trench, and you're back to square one, having lost hundreds, maybe even thousands of men in just pure violent slaughter. As you might imagine, with this type of cycle of warfare and frontal assaults and whatnot, the bodies just started to pile up everywhere. And if you died in the trench, there was a good chance that they just buried you in the trench, just at the feet of your battle buddies. And if you died outside of the trench and you were close enough, or behind the front line trench, you were probably buried up top. And this basically led to a situation where you're living in a trench full of mud, your buddies are buried nearby, some aren't even buried at all, some are partially buried because they've been uncovered by the rain, and the stench of death is just unescapable all around you all the time. Sometimes a soldier would accidentally step through the decomposing chest cavity of one of his comrades that had been buried in a shallow grave in the trench floor. And of course, with that amount of rotting bodies not properly buried, as you might imagine, there became a huge rat problem. Rat infestations plagued the living and wounded alike. Critically wounded men trapped in no man's land would be heard screaming in horror as hordes of rats ate them alive, their buddies unable to do a damn thing about it. So, as you can imagine, people snapped on a daily basis and literally went insane, or just killed themselves outright, or by charging alone into no man's land hoping to get shot like a dog. Very often, those who snapped because of the unbearable psychological horror that they witnessed, or through sheer terror, and failed to advance out of the trench when it was their call to go up into no man's land, they were either shot on the spot for failing to advance, or arrested and summarily executed by firing squad. As the months turned to years, new weapons were developed in an effort to rout the enemy out of the trenches. This included chlorine gas and the flamethrower. Now, we all know what a flamethrower does to a man, but chlorine gas, that's some especially hideous shit. The gas killed a man by interacting with the water content in the respiratory tract, creating a chemical reaction that turned into hydrochloric acid, so that a man literally suffocates by having his lungs and throat dissolve. I mean, suffocation is a pretty horrible way to die, but suffocation as you feel like your lungs are literally dissolving, it's unimaginable. Even Adolf Hitler himself, who experienced the gas in the trenches of World War I, refused to allow its use in World War II. Even that monster considered it to be too horrible of a weapon of war. Anyway, to get back on track, what does World War I have to do with Vietnam, you ask? Well, since communism played a pretty significant role in Vietnam, it's important to note that communism really started to blossom towards the end of World War I. By 1917, the war had basically devolved into a stalemate, one of unimaginable horror, as the things I've just described continue to happen over and over, and no ground was being made. So the Germans were desperate for something to turn the tide in their favor. Societal discontent in Russia began to reach a boiling point as the peasant class seethed with rage and animosity at the royal family. Germany exploited this social division by returning revolutionary leader Vladimir Lenin and 30 other revolutionaries from exile. Germany hoped to amplify societal discord in Russia by supporting Lenin's Marxist movement so that Russia would quit the war. The plan worked. Lenin and his Bolshevik revolutionaries seized control of the government. They executed the royal family, and the beginning of communist Russia had begun, later to birth a global communist movement that directly contributed to the war in Korea and Vietnam 4 decades later. Now, perhaps one note of interest, the Germans considered Lenin and his ideology to be so toxic and to be such a mind virus that they put them on a train that was sealed tight with no chance for them to interact with the populace, because that's how significant of a threat they considered the Marxist mind virus to be. Okay, moving on. So World War I eventually ended. The Germans were just absolutely decimated militarily. Economically, they were racked by pretty harsh sanctions and, well, reparations. They were forced to pay back a lot of money for war damages. And this decimated their economy, created a situation where inflation was so bad that the German people literally burned wheelbarrows full of dollars because that's how useless their dollars were. And this intense poverty and also the kind of psychological blow of being defeated is what set the conditions for a figure like Adolf Hitler to rise to the forefront of political consciousness in Germany. So I'm going to breeze through World War II because chances are, if you're listening to this, you already probably know a little bit about what happened in World War II. Most people do. In America, it's the most popular war, I'd say. Everybody knows what happens, but I'll give a quick recap. Hitler comes to power. He's convinced the German people, who are pretty bitter about the last 2 decades and their defeat during World War I, that Nazism is the right way to go. A lot of animosity is projected on the Jewish people. There's a lot of rationale that the Nazis used to justify this belief, but ultimately, as far as I can tell, they were just looking for a scapegoat to blame all their problems on. And the Jews have historically been it. So the Jews get rounded up, they get sent to concentration camps, they're sent to death camps where they're executed, exterminated, and it's a absolutely horrifying event in human history that is worthy of its own podcast. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., I highly, highly recommend you check out the Holocaust Museum. It's disturbing. It's worth it because you really grasp the magnitude of sheer madness that was that systematic annihilation of the Jewish people. Anyway, the United States ends up getting involved in World War II after Tokyo sends suicide kamikaze bombers to attack Pearl Harbor, and that's in Hawaii. When Japan declares war on the United States, Germany follows suit, and Germany therefore opening the door for the United States to say, all right, fuck it, we're down the clown. You guys want to start some shit? We'll finish it. And finish it we did. We invaded Italy. That was pretty intense combat, but we basically steamrolled through Italy, deposed fascist dictator and ally of Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and that was what gave us time to perfect our amphibious landing techniques, which we utilized to invade France. And yes, I did say invade France. Wait a minute, what do you mean we invaded France? That means the Nazis took France? Didn't you just tell us about some pretty epic and insane battles to keep France from falling in World War I? Yes, that's what makes it even more tragic. Just imagine you were a 20-something-year-old grunt in the trenches of World War I. You heroically survived somehow by the grace of God, and whatever you witnessed, you wish you didn't, and you take it with you the rest of your days, hoping for a brighter future, just to watch the next generation just get steamrolled by Germany. Granted, by the time World War II kicked off, and because France had lost so many men during World War I, they really didn't have the people, the military might, or the wherewithal to do it again. But it had to have been absolutely crushing to see the Germans succeed where once they had failed. And especially considering the sheer horrors witnessed and endured by the troops that fought and witnessed their buddies die just to stop the Germans from taking Paris. Anyway, the United States came and they invaded Italy, liberated it, invaded France on D-Day, June 6, 1944. And quickly, I'll recap my Ranger history here because this is pretty significant. But as part of Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of Normandy, there were some German bunkers up on top of a cliff line known as Point du Hoc. These were about 100 feet cliffs. So my Ranger buddies back in World War II, 2nd Ranger Battalion, climbed up 100-foot cliffs while taking intense fire from Germans firing straight down on their heads. They climbed up over those cliffs. They knocked out the bunkers, and they pushed inland until they set up a checkpoint, rallied their follow-on forces, and just continued to push. 2nd Ranger Battalion and a whole slew of other infantry, not just American and not just Rangers, continued to push, engaging the Nazis, fighting them in intense combat, and pushing them back all the way to Berlin, which ultimately fell. And all the Nazi high command, including Adolf Hitler, killed themselves or were captured. This wrapped up the European front, and even though we had liberated Europe from Hitler, the Pacific island chain that leads from Japan south across the Pacific was still being hotly disputed, and the Japanese were putting up a fierce resistance against U.S. Marine Corps, Army, and Navy personnel. The Pacific Campaign was a situation where the Japanese had a whole chain of islands that they controlled. They dug in, they fortified fighting positions, and they were hell-bent on holding the territory at all costs. Death was the only option. If you lived, you were a coward. You were going to be ostracized in society, and basically you were expected to kill yourself or die fighting before surrendering to the United States. And that's exactly what happened. Marine Corps and Army combat personnel would invade one of these islands with naval gunfire support from their backs, and they would uproot the Japanese. They were hell-bent on holding the ground at all costs. They were extremely bloody battles, very insane. Human wave attacks by the Japanese where they would just charge, screaming "Banzai!" into gunfire. The Marines and the Army infantry would engage them, and oftentimes it became hand-to-hand combat of the most brutal and vicious type, very much like World War I. And once an island was liberated, that secured one more foothold to bring supplies in and lengthen out the supply chain to reinforce the next battle. And so battle was fought after battle for island after island until eventually we became so close that we were within bombing range of Tokyo. Once within bombing range of Tokyo, the United States and our allies engaged in a pretty intense bombing campaign where we bombed any strategic and or population center that we thought might weaken the resolve or the supply chain or the logistical support for the Japanese army on the mainland. And it was getting to the point where the Japanese citizens were literally prepared to send their children into combat, expecting the United States to invade the mainland. And it was expected that no less than 1 million men would die. 1 million U.S. men, I should say. The Japanese body count would for sure be well over 1 million. They were prepared to basically sacrifice their entire civilization to avoid being conquered by the United States. Now, real quick, and I feel kind of bad that I didn't think of this when I was talking about Europe earlier, but I need to mention the Russian role in World War II because it's pretty important to note. So Vladimir Lenin takes over control of the government in 1918, and after him comes dictator Joseph Stalin. Now, I won't go into the details right now in this episode of how bad the Soviet Union was with their people, but they were a significant wartime ally to the United States and the Allies during World War II. And the reason why this was is because just like in World War I, the Germans executed a very, very similar plan to the Schlieffen Plan, where they powered through Belgium, straight into France, and they also deployed significant resources to the Eastern Front to try to head off the Russians before they could mobilize in time. And it succeeded. The Germans steamrolled into Russia and basically just started powering through into Russia. The Russians, left with no choice, engaged in a scorched earth policy of retreat where they fell back, took all the people, burned everything, destroyed everything that was of any tactical value or could possibly help the German soldiers, and just continued to fall back and fall back and fall back until the Russian winter came. And then by then, the Germans had overextended their supply lines, and winter hit, and winters in Russia are extremely cold, as I'm sure you may have heard. And ultimately, it was enough to cause the Germans to lose steam, and the Russians ultimately carried the victory. But a significant battle of note is the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the most significant and brutal battles of World War II. It took place from July 17th, 1942, all the way to February 2nd, 1943. It was a strategically important industrial city on the Volga River. Capturing it would have cut Soviet transport links with southern Russia, and Hitler thought he could get it as a pretty significant propaganda victory, if absolutely nothing else. And it was an urban warfare, intense, close combat type battle where the Nazis were in this big city and there were civilians in the city. There was Russian troops. It was very much akin to maybe Fallujah, except certainly more intense for several reasons. But it lasted for a long time. I mean, July to February is a long time to engage in any battle, but a battle that goes from summer all the way into winter in an urban environment, that's not good. People are going to starve. Diseases are going to outbreak. It's just going to be pure hell. And it was. Approximately 300,000 German troops and 500,000 Soviet soldiers perished. Of the 300,000 German soldiers who were trapped in the city, only about 91,000 survived to be taken prisoner, and only around 6,000 of those eventually returned home. It's estimated that the total combined Russian civilian and soldier killed during the Battle of Stalingrad is somewhere around 1 million people. So that's around 1 million dead Russians in a 6-month period, and 500,000 Germans in half a year alone on one front of World War II. Throughout World War II, it is estimated that the Soviet Union suffered 7.5 million military dead and 10 to 15 million civilian deaths. Now listen, say what you want about the Soviet Union. Trust me, I ain't no fan, but you gotta admit, they took the brunt of World War II. They really did. No other country comes anywhere close to the number of dead suffered by the Soviet Union. So anyway, back to the Pacific Theater and Japan. So Europe wraps up, we liberate, Russians take immense casualties, unfathomable, but the United States is still in the fight, and so are the Russians for that matter. And the United States is within striking distance of Japan, and on March 9th through March 10th, 1945, the United States engages in a massive firebombing raid on Tokyo that kills at least 80,000 people, some estimates of over 100,000 total casualties. It's called Operation Meeting House, and it's considered one of the most destructive bombing raids in history. I mean, 80,000 people in one day, that's absolutely insane. But it only gets worse because on August 6th, 1945, the United States dropped the first ever atomic bomb on Hiroshima. This bomb killed approximately 70 to 135,000 people. And then that didn't do it. Japan was still ready to go. Even though we had firebombed the shit out of Tokyo, killed 80,000 people, dropped an unseen weapon of absolute destruction called the atomic bomb that killed 70 to 135,000 people in a single blast. And that wasn't enough to bring them to their knees. So 3 days later, on October 9th, 1945, we dropped another atomic bomb. And this bomb killed approximately 60,000 to 80,000 people. So total air raid casualties on Japan from 1942 to 1945 resulted in the death of between 241,000 to 900,000 people. And guess what? The Japanese still didn't drop out of the war. So real quick recap. On August 6th, 1945, the United States drops the first A-bomb on Hiroshima. Japanese don't surrender. On August 8th, 1945, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and quickly advances into Manchuria, which is a section of China that borders Russia and was held by the Japanese at the time. Still don't surrender. On August 9th, we drop another A-bomb on Nagasaki, and the Japanese still don't surrender. It takes them until August 15th, 1945 to officially surrender. So if all that doesn't paint the picture of the Japanese mentality at the time well enough, then you should know that the surrender speech that Emperor Hirohito gave on August 15th, 1945 is called the Jewel Voice Broadcast because it was the first time the Japanese people had ever heard their emperor's voice. His speech is pretty insane. They never once used the word surrender, but I recommend you look it up if you want to read the whole thing, but here is one paragraph. Quote, "Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Such being the case, how are we to save the millions of our subjects or to atone ourselves before the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers." So you can see that the Japanese were pretty much the most fanatical enemy that the United States has ever squared up against. And even though they were willing to eat millions of dead civilians to maintain their war against the Allies, ultimately the threat of nuclear annihilation was just too great, even for the Japanese, which should say a lot. And it should say a lot because, as we'll see with the Cold War, it just gets crazier and crazier in terms of nuclear armament and nuclear capabilities. The A-bomb isn't even the most insane nuclear weapon ever devised. It's only the smallest, actually. But anyway, I think I'm going to wrap it up for this episode. I thought I was going to be able to power through all the way to the start of the French Indochina War in just this one episode, but there's going to be another episode that's going to cover the fall of Japan, the rise of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, and talk about French colonialism, we're going to go into the Cold War and talk about Korea briefly. And I just can't stuff it all in this episode. So if you really, really, really just want to get to Vietnam, then skip ahead. I don't blame you, but I really think it's important to have fresh in your mind the backdrop of what leads to the French Indochina War, and that is World War II. What leads to World War II? That's World War I. How does World War I play into any of it? It's the beginning of the communist Russian state, which ends up being the number one backer of communism and the number one opponent of the United States. So anyway, until next time, everybody, I hope you learned a lot, and I hope you'll tune in to the next episode. Thanks so much. And one last thing, I want to give a special shout out to the folks over at www.zapsplat.com who provided the sound effects that you've heard here today. All right, everybody, take it easy.